Melusine by Reid. Chapter 21, The Dawn Search. The goats were all lying half asleep in the straw of the enclosure. Only a few of them got up when he came among them. He dared not use the candle here for fear of setting the straw and hay on fire, but in any case it was getting light. He wandered about among the flock, peering into the dark corners by the back wall, though it was fairly obvious she couldn't be here. One of the goats wandered after him, and he turned and stroked her head. The goats had been the first link between him and Melusine. He whispered, "You know where she is if you could talk," but that was stupid. He opened the bottom half of the split door into the dairy and ducked under the top part to enter. Here he could light the candle. He stood for a while with it flickering over the bench where they had sat the day she cried, and the flies had crawled over her bare knees. Later, in her bedroom, he had seen her crying again, and that was the closest he had come to her. He realized with a shock that some part of him had enjoyed her tears. His eyes went to the nail on which hung the thick swatch of coarse string the ogre had used to tie the hurdles together, and which Roger had used for tethers. It was this that Melusine had twisted and coiled to make the foundation for her tiny wreath, sticking wildflowers through it till they covered the front of it. He knew it was she who had made it, and he imagined her creeping up to the tower to leave it on the floor, an echo, a memorial. Whose body had been in the coffin? It must have been someone she loved. Why had they not been properly buried? What was the secret behind that weird shrine? No wonder she had struck his hand the first day when he had reached toward the door of that grim, forbidden place. What secret had she been carrying, and for how long? Apart from her own terrible secret. Not for the first time, Roger seemed to feel the weight of her pain in his own heart. He was too young to feel so much. He tried to lift it with a deep sigh, but it wouldn't move. And then something seemed to twang in his heart like a note of warning. At the back of his mind had been the notion that now that it was all over, the ogre dead, she would be happy, relieved, free. But in that case, why was she hiding? Suddenly, it was as if his thoughts and feelings dropped several notches deeper into greater understanding. The ogre, however, mad, was Melusine's father. Whatever he did to her, whatever terrible mysteries surrounded him and his life with her in this place, there were normal things, too. Everyday things, trips to the coast, meals together, washing up, and shared work with the goats, companionship. Roger's father had hinted that the trouble was that the two of them were alone here together, isolated, thrown back on each other's company. Because of this, the ogre had grown too fond of Melusine. But what about her? Did she hate him as Roger had been sure she must, simply because Roger himself did, and because what he suspected of their relationship was hateful? Or might she, in between hating her father, love him in some sadly awful way, because she had no one else, in which case his sudden death might not be a simple release for her. She would be shocked. She would almost certainly be frightened about what would become of her now. Knowing this, even in his drugged state yesterday, was what had made Roger so anxious about her. But what if she were also grieving? What if, now that the most important person, perhaps the only person in her life, was suddenly gone, she felt she had nothing left? What if the weight Roger felt in his heart were so heavy in Melusine's that she hadn't felt able to go on living? What if that pathetic little wreath were not only for the mysterious body in the coffin, but for her father? What if it were for herself? As this thought surfaced, he panicked. He began to hunt for her feverishly, irrationally. He dropped the candle, and with both hands now free, he began throwing empty chairs on their sides, wrenching aside piles of wooden boxes and sweeping tools and other things off deep shelves with his arms. The noise and confusion were pointless. There were no serious hiding places at all, but somehow he needed to give way to violent action. When he'd reduced the dairy to chaos, he stood in the midst of it, panting and staring around with wild eyes. In one corner he noticed a pitchfork that had escaped his fury. He hurled himself at it to knock it to the floor, and then he stopped. Beside it was an opening in the wall covered with a bit of sacking. He thrust this aside and found himself in a small, low shed full of bales of hay and straw. The smell of it halted him and soothed his furious, destructive mood. It was such a good smell, full of natural sweetness. Daylight was creeping in through a large opening facing the paddock. He could hear the birds beginning to sing outside and the goats stirring. Normality and a new day. And as his rage left him, like a reward for calm, he saw her. He saw only one bare foot at first, high up amid the bales. He climbed them like big soft stairs and peered down at her in the dusty dimness. His heart was beating thickly because of his earlier fear that she had harmed herself. But as soon as he could see her fully, he knew she was all right, just fast asleep. She had hidden herself carefully under a layer of hay, but she must have stuck one foot out while she slept, an unconscious signal to him to find her. He looked at her for a while, just savoring his relief, then he reached down over the topmost bale and touched her shoulder. She woke and sat up in a flash. There was no sunlight yet in the shed, but as she rose up out of the hay, he gasped. She seemed to gleam. Her hair, for the first time since he met her, was out of its plait and hung loose around her face and over her shoulders. She had been lying in the dusty hay for hours, yet it shone, black and clean and beautiful. It softened her face. The skin of her face and arms glowed as if they'd been polished. As he stared at her, he found himself thinking of Kaa in the Jungle Book after the great python shed his skin. Melusine had emerged from her snake self. She was all human now, and that shedding had taken away the snake look she had had, leaving her almost supernaturally new and beautiful. Her eyes were still round, but now they were not button-like and reptilian anymore. They were warm and glowing, even though a little swollen with sleep and weeping. Her mouth was no longer a straight cut in her face, but had softened. It was as if before she had always been biting her lips, but now he could see them clearly. He could also see, through her near beauty, that she was stricken with shock and sorrow, and the aftermath of terror. "Comment que va?" he asked her softly. "I've been looking for you." "Je chez toi?" he said, gazing at her in a sort of astonishment. "Mon père est mort," she whispered at once, as if this answered everything he might ask her, and he knew he had guessed at least some of her feelings. "I know. Come on." He stood from his couch and helped her over the top bale and down the bale steps to the ground. He noticed at once that her skin was different. It didn't have the snake feel anymore. It was a girl's hand that he held. He led her back through the sunlight to his family. No one knew how to treat her when they first saw her. It was clear to Roger that they all noticed a difference in her. His mother could hardly believe her eyes, but she said nothing, simply drew Melusine into the kitchen and sat her down, put her own cardigan around her shoulders, and found her something to eat and drink. His father's jaw dropped when he saw her. Then he pulled himself together and went to tell the police officer who was still on duty in front of the chateau. The twins simply gazed and gazed, sitting on either side of Melusine at the table. Emma actually reached out and touched her hair. Melusine didn't seem to notice. She was slowly eating and drinking what was put in front of her and keeping her face down. Her hair swung forward on either side and hid her eyes from the twins, but Polly signed with a finger down her cheek to Emma. "Don't, she's crying." For once they were tactful and got up quietly and went away. But when Roger began to follow, thinking that Melusine probably didn't want anyone there, she stopped eating and looked at him sharply, pleadingly through tear-filled eyes. "Don't go." He swallowed and sat down again opposite her. His mother said, "Where was she?" "In the shed where the goats' food and bedding is," his mother in a distant sort of voice said. "What'll happen to the goats now, I wonder?" She was very fond of animals. Still, it seemed an odd thing to be worried about. Wasn't she worried about what would happen to Melusine? It was, when all else was said and done, the only thing that seemed to Roger to matter now. And that is the end of chapter 21.